And her talk and second book project, which she's going to be speaking about today, Claiming My Egypt, which is subtitled Reflections on a Modern Jewish Diaspora, but we would need a longer subtitle to do the intricacies of the work credit and justice, but that's thankfully why Professor Rhona Seidelman is going to start right now. I would just pin that in.
Should pin this on me or? Thank you. Thank you to Alan. Thank you to Trice for everything, always sort of keeping us afloat in the Schusterman Center. I want to thank the OU Arts and Humanities Forum. I received a grant from them in 2020, which I think without receiving that grant, I probably wouldn't have continued with this project during the pandemic. So I'm glad that I did, and I'm really grateful for that. The paper that I'm presenting today, actually it isn't a book manuscript. This is an essay, sort of a standalone essay that actually came out with World Literature Today. Oh, you can't hear me, David? Okay, I can speak closer to the microphone, okay. I'm gonna see if it'll lean out to me. I think it will. This is an essay that I wrote that came out with World Literature Today, I think around 2 weeks ago or so. I want to thank Daniel Simon and everyone at World Literature Today. Am I doing something wrong?
I'm just going to turn off the volume.
Oh, okay. Because I'm thrilled that it came out with WLT, and it's such a pleasure to work with Daniel. And then thanks to all of you for taking the time to be here today. I'm very happy to be sharing this work with you. There are a few parts to my talk. I'll be giving some background on Egyptian Jewish history, and then I'll discuss themes of language, family, material possessions, and then a final section that I call Full Circle deals with Israel. Can people hear me in the back? Okay, good. Oh, one last thing that I want to add is that I was welcomed back to Oklahoma. We came back around 2 months ago, and I was welcomed back with Oklahoma allergies, which are significant, right? And which means that I look like I'm crying all the time. Anyone who knows me knows that I cry very easily, but I'm not starting out crying. So just so you know why I'm constantly wiping my eyes here. Let me just make sure. I can, if I do this maybe?
Yeah.
Yes, perfect. What I've started off with here is a photograph of my grandparents' wedding in Alexandria in 1934. When my mother is on the Mediterranean shore, usually these days in the comfort of a modest Tel Aviv cafe, there's always a moment when she turns to the water. She closes her eyes and deeply breathes in the salty air. Then, her face still turned to the sea, she declares, "I was born on this water." When she's in a playful mood, my mother will explain that what must have happened is that when she was born in 1946 in the Jewish hospital in Alexandria, Egypt, my grandmother cradled her in her arms and took her to the window to face the glorious sea. And in that moment, an impenetrable bond was sealed. I love the beauty of the Mediterranean Sea. It's hard not to, but I don't have that same bond. I was born 3 decades later, thousands of miles away, across a sea, an ocean, continents, cultures, and languages. I was born to a mother formed and wounded by expulsion, a woman who was forced from her home, displaced from her family, and removed from her sea. The history of the erasure of the Jewish community in Egypt, as well as the stories of Egypt's exiled Jews, have been solidly documented over the past 30 years. These works powerfully evoke the lives, communities, and cultures of the Jews while they were living in Egypt, the conditions that led to their dispersal, the difficult rupture that came with their forced migrations, and their assimilation in new homelands. But what about the children of Egypt's Jewish diaspora? What of Egypt is left in us? What claim, if any, do we have to this country that has shaped who we are? Are we at all Egyptian? To help answer these questions, I turn for inspiration to the autobiographical essays of women intellectuals of Middle Eastern descent, Henriette Dahan Kalev, Ella Shochat, and Gada Karmi. These scholars have each used their own historically contextualized personal experiences of migration to give meaning to complicated layers of identity. And so I echo Shochat's declaration, it is crucial to say we exist. The history and wounds of Egypt did not stop with our parents. They continued on to the next generation, contributing layers of identity that are at once rich, transnational, and displaced. This is a famous photograph of Mohammed Naguib, who was the first president of the Republic of Egypt, visiting a synagogue in Cairo, I believe in 1952. And the man standing next to him in a dark suit is my grandfather. So at its peak in 1948, the Jewish community of Egypt numbered approximately 80 to 100,000 people. Although a small minority group, Jews played a leading role in Egypt's cultural and economic life, particularly in the urban centers of Cairo and Alexandria. But with the July Revolution of 1952, and then especially with the rise of Nasser in 1954, still allergies, life in Egypt became increasingly perilous for the Jewish community. The rise of Egyptian nationalism in this time was renegotiating identity in a way that actively framed Jews as non-Egyptians, and the violent wars that Egypt fought with Israel, which was established as a Jewish state in 1948, this put all of the country's Jews in a precarious position where they were viewed with antagonism and suspicion as hostile aliens, even in cases where they were not Zionists and vocally asserted their loyalty to Egypt. Gradually, Jews were forced out of the country that they had lived in for generations, with targeted expulsions in 1956, 1957, and 1967. These acts, combined with a general climate that made Jews socially and economically vulnerable, meant that within 20 years, this once flourishing community was almost completely erased. By 1968, there were only 1,000 Jews left in Egypt, and this is, again, 80 to 100,000 were the numbers before, and today only a handful remain. My mother comes from a typical Egyptian Jewish family. They were deeply connected to and lived as part of the Egyptian Jewish communities in Cairo and Alexandria. And my mother left Egypt in 1955. Her parents no longer felt economically or personally safe as Jews there, and so my grandfather decided that they too needed to leave. After a few years in Paris, they eventually moved to Vancouver, British Columbia, which is where I was born. But my mother has never told stories of holding me up to look at the Pacific Ocean, like her mother was said to have done for her and the Mediterranean. Through my Canadian-born Ashkenazi father, I inherited the very defined, unbroken experience of belonging to a place that comes with the facets of a clear, undisturbed modern national identity with citizenship, language, a local accent, physical community, and familiar culture. And through my mother, I inherited something very different. This is a picture of my mother on the boat leaving Egypt in 1955. During my time teaching at American universities, I met a senior Egyptian American professor who asked if I speak Arabic. I happily responded with the few words that I know in a not too terrible accent. And in return, he smiled politely and said nothing more. After our exchange, his disapproval registered and I felt silly. I wondered why I hadn't simply answered, no, I don't speak Arabic as a living, full language. But still, it had never occurred to me to say no, because the few Arabic words that I do know are not a shtick or an intellectual exercise. They are a vital part of me. To the extent that my mother has one mother tongue, it is French. Like most Egyptian Jews, her family lived in many languages, and the way they communicated in their household was far from straightforward. My grandmother, her mother tongue was Arabic, and she was fluent in French. She was also comfortable in Greek and Italian. She spoke with her children in French, but with her husband, my grandfather Abdou, she spoke in Arabic. For his part, my grandfather's French was not strong. His first language was Arabic, and his English was flawless. So he spoke with his children in Arabic, but they responded in French. So it's sort of complicated, but it was very natural. This was a situation that my father encouraged. As was common among upper middle class urban Egyptians of his time, he insisted that his children receive a French education. But historians of modern Egypt clarify that this wouldn't have marked my family as outsiders at that time. For my grandfather, who was a banker, French was a language of necessity in the business world, and it would have offered his children the promise of eventual economic opportunities or business connections. But it was also a language of prestige and modernity. And this was for Muslims and Christians as much as for Jews. And so these European languages were my family's priority, and my mother and her siblings never learned how to read or write in Arabic. But Arabic was inherent to their life in Egypt, and the language was loved and respected by my grandparents. In addition to what she learned by hearing her parents speak, my mother picked up Arabic in day-to-day interactions and from movies and from her family's domestic workers. When my sisters and I were young, my mother spoke to us in French, but in Hamilton, Ontario, where I grew up, English was the language of our home. My sisters and I retained some proficiency in the French language, and it took on a special, intimate role in our relationship with my mother. Our lullabies were the songs of the French singers Charles Aznavour, Yves Montand, and Edith Piaf, and Enrico Macias. Our mother endearingly refers to us as Chouchou, which means little cabbage. And when we were children and she needed to give us motherly admonitions, especially in front of others, they were always in French, along the lines of "Ça suffit, assieds-toi, and qu'est-ce qu'on dit," which is like, enough, sit down, and what do you say, like please and thank you. Today, when she wants to say something that isn't suitable for my children to hear, my mother will conspiratorially switch into French before smoothly moving back into English. If French is the language through which my mother conveys intimacy and love, Arabic was my grandmother's. My Arabic words, the ones that I shared with the Egyptian American professor, are almost entirely my grandmother's terms of endearment. For my mother, I am Chouchou. For my grandmother, I was Yarochi or Yabinti, my soul, my daughter. As an adult, after I learned a new Arabic phrase from my mother, I called my grandmother to try it out. This is a version of Shavua Tov, which is the traditional Jewish greeting used to wish someone a good week at the end of the Sabbath. Gomaytek Chadra, Nona, I said over the phone, may you have a green week. My grandmother was overjoyed, Ayabinti, Gomaytek Chadra, Yarochi. My other Arabic word is one that my grandmother gave to my mother and that she in turn passed on directly to me, and that is akruta. In English, this would be translated into something like rascal, but with love and bite to it. In Hebrew, I think of it along the lines of mamzera. And for my grandmother, my mother's aunts and my mother's sisters, my mother was always an akruta. And very early on, my mother made it clear to me that I was one too. And now there is no question that my daughter is also. Language seems to distance me from claims to Egypt. When a Palestinian friend teased me after hearing my mother speak for the first time. He joked that her fluent French showed him just how Egyptian she really was. The implication, as I understood it, was that she was a colonizer, not a true Egyptian. We never discussed whether he considered me at all Egyptian. I feel certain he would have laughed at the notion. Certainly, if I were to be conversant in Arabic, then it would all be so much simpler. Like El Ashochat, I could confidently claim my place as a Jew from an Arab land. But the legacy Egypt left its Jews is far from simple. In Egypt, my family's languages were rich. They were complicated and intricately multidirectional. My own patchwork of Arabic and French is the Egypt that I inherited. It is fractured, displaced, incomplete. It is broken and uprooted. It is intimate, loving, and familial. And it is no less Egyptian than another person's flawless Arabic. Still allergies. In 1983, when I was a child, my parents, my two older sisters, and I left Canada for a grand adventure across Europe. We were headed to Israel, where my father was taking a year-long sabbatical. In retrospect, this was much more than just a family excursion. It was a prolonged and disjointed reunion as we met my mother's extended, dispersed Egyptian family for the first and largely for the last time ever. We went from England to France, to Italy, to Switzerland, and then finally to Israel. On this cross-continental journey, my mother, now a 38-year-old woman, had the chance to spend time with the family members who once had anchored her day-to-day existence. And for the first time, I had the opportunity to see my mother as a person who was not a transplanted exotic. Among her warm, enveloping, extended family, she fit. Among them, she was not the Egyptian, French, Mediterranean, Sephardic Jewish woman in waspy, restrained, Ashkenazi Jewish, Anglo-Canadian, snowy Ontario. For me as a child, these encounters across the world were great fun. Excuse me. But now, as an adult, these encounters feel more complicated as I wonder what we lost through this dispersal. Growing up, the pastness of Egypt for me was something I never questioned. Egypt had once belonged to my family, or at least my family had once belonged there, but there was nothing for us there anymore, and we would certainly never return. For the vast majority of my life, the only other Egyptians I had ever met were a few other Jews or their children. The break from Egypt as a physical location, as a country of belonging, was just as stark for them as it was for my family, and so this pastness was reinforced. But when I moved to America when I was in my mid-30s, for the first time I met Egyptians who are not Jewish. Like my family, they're living abroad, but unlike my family, they have Egypt to return to. They have a continuity that had never even occurred to me. As they extend their horizons abroad, Egypt gives them an anchor of identity and family to which they can choose or not choose to return. The contrast between their continuity and my discontinuity from the same country, their identity being allowed and legitimate, and ours cut off and denied, pushed me to see that what I had accepted as a mythic past is first and foremost a contingent history. And for the first time, I began to imagine what a counterfactual history could have looked like with visits to my grandparents in Cairo and summer trips to Alexandria. I could imagine an unbroken sense of belonging, of being Egyptians in Egypt, spending time in the home my mother grew up in, with the organic and strengthening presence of family all around, not scattered around the globe. Salman Rushdie has described the state of being a migrant as a burdensome freedom. I grew up seeing my mother's story in this way. My mother conveyed to me that leaving Egypt was burdensome. It was hard to become poor. It was hard for her parents to find a home they felt safe in and suited to outside of Egypt. It was hard for her to fit in the overwhelmingly Ashkenazi Jewish community in Vancouver, Canada. But my mother also conveyed to me that her migration was a freedom. Life is easier with less material objects to worry about. It's fun to bring an interesting and different culture to share with new neighbors, and it's valuable to know different languages. The focus my mother was given and transmitted was how much we have, despite how much was taken away. But what fades into the background and is the undercurrent that shapes this experience is that something profound was indeed taken away from us. Historian Tara Zara describes how in contemporary Europe, the privilege of mobility is, quote, associated with freedom. But she also brings attention to the fact that for many, the idea of true freedom is one that allows the person the choice to stay at home. In 1983, when we arrived at the home of my grandmother's sister in Italy, I was the first up the stairs as Tante Flore eagerly opened her apartment door. When she saw me, her face had a look of shock and temporary confusion as she called out my mother's name, exclaiming, "It's Rashlin." When my mother came up a few minutes later, and the two women laughed and embraced. In Egypt, my mother was the akruta who used to defy her aunt and pick rose petals to put on her fingernails as flaming red fingernails. In Egypt, Tante Flore was certain that her niece, my mother, brought her good luck, and she would insist that she stand next to her at the gambling table to ensure a generous win. And it was in Tante Flore's house in Alexandria that my mother would gather with her family for their indulgent summer beach holidays. And when the extended family was chipped apart, it was my mother who held on to Flore's correspondence, a pile of handwritten cards from across the world effusing love and longing. She wrote, "I think of you often. I embrace you tenderly. Your aunt who loves you, your sister who loves you. I miss you so much." In 1983, when I bounded up the stairs in Milan and Tante Flore and my mother were reunited, the last time they had seen one another was nearly 30 years before, when my mother was a child who looked like me. Our time at Flore's home in Milan was loving and crazy. It was a reunion that for a brief moment brought together beloved members of a family that once had the freedom to stay together at home. This is actually a picture from that visit. So that's me with my mother and Tante Flore. And my favorite part of this picture is the way Tante Flore is grasping my mother's hand. My mother has almost no attachment to material things. She regularly goes through her closet, giving away books, clothes, makeup, and jewelry, keeping her own possessions to a minimum. Above all, she abhors knickknacks, which she always refers to in the Arabic, karakib. Although it almost certainly has a fuller meaning, I grew up understanding that karakib is only negative. It's a word my mother almost always says with disdain and with a wave of her hand. It's karakib, Rhona. Who needs it? Throw it away. If some object has the bad luck of being labeled by my mother as karakib, its fate is sealed. It has no chance of surviving long in her home. There's something about this quality of hers that I deeply admire, but I don't fully share this trait. I yearn for heirlooms and objects that have longevity and stories. I'm far less eager than my mother to part with possessions, and as a result, and for as long as I can remember, this has been a combustible point between us. Even to this day, as a middle-aged woman and an elderly woman, my mother and I can get into thunderous arguments about things that she thinks should be thrown away, but that I want to keep. Sorry, I've lost this. Here. Many years ago, when I was in high school in Hamilton, a friend came for a visit, and my mother served her tea in a delicate cup that had once belonged to a beloved neighbor. This neighbor had given it to my mother as a special gift, and my mother treasured it. When she learned how precious this fragile cup was, my friend was nervous, and she asked if she could have a different one instead so that she wouldn't risk breaking an irreplaceable memento. My mother quickly set her at ease, saying something she truly believes: if it breaks, it breaks. We should use and enjoy things, not let them collect dust and become karakib. I remember this encounter with pride all these years later. To me, it exemplified the welcoming nature of our home. Unlike some of the stately houses I saw around me in Ontario, my mother made it clear that our priority was on creating a home where people could be at ease. We would not be slaves to objects, as beautiful and as valuable as they may seem. But there were similar interactions that were more irksome. When my close friend Ruthie was over wearing a sweater that she had borrowed from me, this is in high school, my mother, with typical warmth and informality, suggested that since she liked it so much, Ruthie should just keep my sweater. This amused Ruthie and annoyed me, and I made it immediately clear that I was not giving her my sweater. But bothersome as this was, my mother was just applying a philosophy that she fully adheres to herself. There's almost nothing that she owns that she would not give away. If ever my sisters and I compliment her on something, even just to tell her that we like it, invariably my mother's response is, "You like it? Take it." This characteristic of my mother's connects to the experiences she had and the ideas she internalized as a refugee. Of course, letting go of material possessions is a defining part of the migrant experience everywhere. Out of necessity, you shed objects that prohibit movement. There's an important story that's part of my mother's departure from Egypt. When they first arrived in Paris, her family had no money, and they were given food and modest housing through Jewish aid organizations. They ate their meals at a soup kitchen run by the Jewish community. While standing in line with her father to receive these handouts for one of the first times, she asked him whether their new poverty made him sad. But he comforted her, saying, "The less possessions you own, the less worries you have." When my mother relates her story of leaving Egypt, this exchange with my grandfather is at the heart of what she remembers. The formative lesson for her has been to hold on to what is essential and to be willing to let go of karakib. My copy of André Assiman's memoir, Out of Egypt, was given to me as a present by my mother. When the book was published in 1994, I was living in Jerusalem, where I had just begun my undergraduate degree in history at the Hebrew University. Out of Egypt was the first book that brought the story of Egyptian Jews to a broad English-speaking audience. Today, André Assiman is very famous. His book, his novel, Call Me By Your Name, was turned into an Oscar award-winning film. But he is an Egyptian Jew, and he wrote this very important memoir a while back. An avid reader, my mother immediately adored it. She gave copies to whomever she could, eager to share what she saw as a representation of her own family's experiences. I also loved and was grateful for Out of Egypt. This book showed me how the piecemeal stories that I received from family belong within a full and vibrant world. Most of all, I treasured the copy my mother gave me, I still do. In her attentive calligraphy, she inscribed the front pages. She wrote in French of her own exodus out of Egypt and of my own life in Jerusalem. She ended by saying that now, with me in Israel, we had come full circle. As complicated as the sentiment is, and it is complicated, right? Israel is not Egypt. My mother touched on something that is true. Egypt as a physical space has been taken from Jews, but nearby in Israel, I found my Egypt like nowhere else. I found it in the plethora of Egyptian Jews and the children of Egyptian Jews. Through this community that I had never encountered before, I was able to see parts of me in others and connected to a bigger experience. The most important of these relationships for me was with my grandmother's cousin Rachel and her husband Lucien, and this is a picture of their wedding in Alexandria in 1952. I've spent so much time looking at this picture because it's amazing, especially I guess it's on the left, my tante Flore and her outfit, which is just quite amazing with the tiara thing she's wearing and her fur and her shoes. It's a lot of fun to look at. When I was admitted to a PhD program in Beersheba, the city where they lived, Rachel and Lucien, Oncle Lucien phoned me to say how eager they were to help me settle in, since 40 years earlier, my own grandparents had helped them when they were forced out of Egypt. Rachel and Lucien had arrived in Paris in November 1956 after my mother and her family had been there for about a year. And at the time, Lucien was 31 and Rachel was 29, in the early stages of a very delicate pregnancy. And their son Joseph was 3. Lucien had been a teacher at Victoria College in Alexandria, where the future Hashemite king Hussein of Jordan had been his most famous student. While Lucien looked unsuccessfully for work in Paris, my grandmother Allegra took care of her cousin Rachel, and my 10-year-old mother Racheline doted on little Joe. I think if I do this, that's a picture of my mother with Joe in Paris. In May 1957, when Rachel was 7 months pregnant and they had exhausted all other options, they arrived in Israel because there was nowhere else for them to go. Tante Rachel and Oncle Lucien stayed true to their promise of welcoming. They always received me in their Beersheba home with unreserved warmth. I found in them a deeper understanding of who my grandparents had been, the particular lilt of their Egyptian accents and the earnestness of their Jewish faith. And seeing Rachel and Lucien in the midst of their modest and beautiful life in the modest and dusty city of Beersheba, so far from the home and life that had been taken from them in Alexandria, I gained a deeper understanding of the extraordinary but heartbreaking work that our families had put into building new lives in foreign countries. This is a picture of me with Rachel at my wedding, which was also just outside of Beersheba. In Israel, I also found my Egypt in the food. I delight in discovering these vital parts of my family that had been domestic and unusual in our Canadian setting, in the everyday sphere in Israel where they are familiar, accessible, and public. I remember one of the first encounters like this in Jerusalem soon after I'd moved there in 1994. I was in Mini Market, a corner store in the neighborhood of Nachlaot in Jerusalem, and the owner had put out large trays with rows of freshly baked handmade ma'amul. So ma'amul are these cookies that are filled with dates and walnuts. They're these round cookies that are filled with dates and walnuts and covered in icing sugar and crimped with a special tongs that are used specifically for ma'amul. Never before had I seen ma'amul outside our home, and certainly not as a part of everyday life. These cookies made an appearance in our family home only for bat mitzvahs and other rare celebrations that would justify the intensive labor and love that they involved. A fun thing about ma'amul, they were featured on an episode of British Baking Show a few seasons ago, so I'm not sure, and you can see the tongs, they're fun. And you also get a sense of how hard it is to make them. Seeing my grandmother's ma'amul so organically a part of the outside space, my public space for the first time, was thrilling. And so many years later, it continues to delight me. The fresh molocheia leaves a local chef shares with my mother from his garden. My grandmother's kark, sold in supermarkets as a packaged everyday food item, a dish made with do'a in a local Beersheba restaurant. There are many ways that my family does not fit in Israel, and yet I have found there balms for my mother's Egyptian wounds. It has given to her a restorative home and a new type of belonging, a Mediterranean society situated on her sea. It is a place where my mother's history and displacement are understood, where her Jewishness is at ease, and where her otherness is familiar. But of course, at the heart of this country's foundation is its own painful story of refugees, with the many Palestinians who were forced to leave their homes during the 1948 war that established the new state of Israel. By choosing to make our home there, my family is seen angrily by some to be perpetuating colonial injustices against the Palestinians. But of the choices we have, I cannot see that it is more just for us to live anywhere else. To the extent that Jews are allowed to have a home in the world, going from Egypt to France, to Canada, to Israel, is perhaps as full a circle as any. The top is a photograph of my grandparents in their garden in Vancouver, I think around 1963, and the bottom one is the photograph of their wedding that I started with in Alexandria. I have never heard my mother refer to herself unequivocally as Egyptian, despite the fact that she was born there to Egyptian-born parents, that her father worked in the National Bank of Egypt, that her large extended family lived almost exclusively in Egypt, and that her family was fully immersed in the country's life and culture. Egyptian, that explicit claim to belonging, was never a proper fit. She says of herself that she is from Egypt or that she was born in Egypt. I understand that there's no simple explanation for this. The tricky question of whether Jews and other minorities considered themselves or were considered Egyptian permeates studies on modern Egypt. But mine is a contemporary question and a contemporary claim. In our current landscape of changing Middle Eastern identities, it is appropriate that the Jewish minority and their descendants be identified as fully Egyptian, should we so choose. When I recently asked her if she's Egyptian, my mother returned to the way she was once introduced at a party in Canada. Rashlin is a citizen of the world. This transnational identity that she embraces is beautiful and appropriate to who she is and where life has taken her. As a citizen of the world, she brings to life what Ella Shochat has described as the syncretic identities of Jews from Arab lands. My mother, like Shochat, is a woman who does not, quote, dissolve so as to facilitate neat national and ethnic divisions, close quote. For my part, if my mother does not consider herself to be Egyptian, then it seems silly for me to consider myself to be. But I've started to wonder if this is another way that our family has come to embrace a burdensome freedom that was not our choice. By refusing to insist that we are Egyptians, full stop, are we not simply accepting what Nasser decided for us? Is this not the outcome of the slow Egyptian erasure of their Jewish community that took place over decades? Someone has successfully convinced themselves and the world and us that we are not and never were truly Egyptian. My family will never return to Egypt. Our physical break from the country is final, and the Levantine syncretic identity that I inherited from my mother continues on with me and my sister as much as I might like to fight it. For the children of this Jewish diaspora, Egypt is a country that destroyed our community, stole our property, tore apart our families, and scarred our parents. It nourishes our food, enlivens our tongues, imprints our faces, and gives life to our stories. In this way, we are Egyptian, and it is crucial to say we exist. Thank you.